Well, good afternoon, Father's House Church. It's good to see you all again on an episode of Beyond the Message. I'm your host, Gordon, and I'm joined by Pastors Carrie and Jordan today.
Hey, guys.
Single camera setups, having some technical difficulty, but that's not going to stop us from discussing the Word I'm spacing on the series now, but Wisdom and Proverbs. Nature of Wisdom. Thank you, Carrie. And continuing on yesterday, with week 2, talking about Proverbs, wisdom, James, what it means to be wise, the difference between wisdom and knowledge. Very poignant, needed topic, I think, in these days, especially when we have everybody trying to tell you everything. You know, there's always like I think we were talking about it yesterday in Sunday, you know, you got your phone, you got Google, you got all that stuff. So much knowledge at our fingertips, but wisdom is really what you do with it and how you walk out that knowledge and doing it in a godly way. So, yeah, it's been a good series so far. What do you guys think? Carrie, maybe a little biased. You spoke yesterday, but how have you guys been enjoying the series so far?
I really like it. I love when we get to hear multiple voices. I think it brings such different perspectives. And even this past Sunday, like I knew roughly what Darren was going to be talking about, but I thought they just complemented each other so well. So I'm really loving it.
Jordan?
I'm enjoying it as well. And even drawing the distinction between godly wisdom and the world's wisdom, I think is very important. That's something that I feel like Pierre or Anaji touched on a little bit last week, if my memory serves me correctly. And then you, Carrie, yesterday made the very clear distinction in the Garden of Eden between, God's wisdom and then us as humans trying to pursue wisdom on our own, and the consequences when we do that outside of what God has already told us to do and where to find wisdom. So I think that is a really good kind of distinction, and it really opened my eyes to that verse. It's a verse that, how many times have I read it? Probably 1,000. But it's just amazing how the Lord will speak, you know what I mean? Different things at different times when you read his word. So I am definitely enjoying the series.
Good.
What about you, Gordon?
Yeah, definitely. I think wisdom, and especially Proverbs, and I think it was Anaji who said this last week, talking about just the practicality of Proverbs, which it's a really unique book in that sense, in that it really does provide, like you could take it, I'm not saying you should, but if you took it out of the Bible, right, if you just gave it to somebody, they wouldn't necessarily think like, oh, this is a book from the Bible. But it does have that godly wisdom that we're talking about, but it's just presented in that more kind of relatable, actionable way of like, here's how you should do things. Here's what is important and not. And it's an interesting one to study for that same reason, because it really reads a lot differently than the rest of the Bible, because it is so practical, because it is really just, I think, Carrie, you were saying this, right, written advice by Solomon to his sons and his children. It is really a father just like giving the talk to his kids, rather than, whereas the rest of the Bible is more obviously still that and the story, but it is more of a narrative of a nation and generations and kind of how God is present in all these things. Proverbs is more like, here's what to do to rightly walk with God, in a sense, but written from a more human perspective, I think, if that makes sense.
Yes. It does, yeah.
So, but yeah, so getting into it though, I guess, we can, I don't know where you guys want to start. There's so much that we could talk about. It's an interesting series because we have, at least for the last 2 weeks, had 2 speakers kind of bringing their own perspective. So we have a lot of different angles, perspectives. Carrie, maybe we could start with you yesterday. I wanted to kind of get into this because you were talking a lot about the fear of God, which I know personally I would have never correlated with godly wisdom. And so I guess maybe, I don't know if you just want to kind of explain it maybe a little bit, kind of what you were talking about, but where did that come from? and how did you kind of make that connection that said, okay, well, let's talk about the fear of God, but then also connect it to wisdom in this sense? Because obviously both are I've just never heard them connected really before. It kind of was new.
Well, when I started studying Proverbs, I saw it repeated so many times. And then I remembered last week when Pierre referenced the 7 pillars of wisdom, and one of them is the fear of the Lord. So that's when I really started studying it. And fear of the Lord comes up multiple times in the Bible, Old Testament and New. But really, as I started studying it, it's all about the heart. And, you know, when I started thinking about Solomon and studying his story, like there's a reason why he did not listen to God when it came to his wives. Like there was a heart issue there. I don't believe that he fully surrendered in every other area of his life. And this one particular one, it was just because he felt like it that day. Like I think there's probably an issue of lust or something there. And then when I started reading, especially at the beginning, because the first 9 chapters really kind of frame, they're not the little snippets like the rest of Proverbs is. I started circling all of the words that either related to the heart or motives, or the word fear of the Lord, and it's everywhere. So, and actually the way we put these series together is usually the senior management team and the creative team come together, and there's a topic. Pastor Marlise really dives into it. And then we started looking at all Proverbs, and we realized fear of the Lord is a main theme. So we knew we wanted to kind of camp on it at some point, and I just could not get away with it. Like from it, the more I studied it, I was like, no, this is so important, because you can have all the intellectual wisdom, but if your heart's not right, you're going to use it for your own motives. And then as I started reading it, it reminded me of Genesis, because there are phrases in there, like when Eve eats of the tree of knowledge, it says she did what is right in her own eyes. Right. And one of the first Proverbs says, do not do what is wise in your own eyes. Mm-hmm. Even wisdom referring to herself as the tree of life. We've got the tree of life versus the tree of knowledge. So then when I went back to Genesis, I was like, whoa, my mind was literally blown. Because same thing that you said, Jordan. I had read Genesis a million times. And understanding the tree of knowledge in that way, it was like, oh no, this changes everything. So yeah.
Yeah, interesting. And I think it's a good point, because when you think about, if the fear of God is a tough one to even wrap your head around sometimes, because it is, the word fear, I think, gives it a lot more of a different connotation than what it really means. And to me, the fear of God has always been like that respect for his power, in a sense, mm-hmm. like being aware of what will happen if you choose to go the other way. And so I think that's an interesting connection to then bring it to these actual choices of action, and how if you choose to trust God and kind of respect that fear, that is when you get opened up to the wisdom.
Right.
So I think it's a very interesting and way of kind of connecting those two, connecting us to wisdom, I guess I should say, and trust too. I mean, I know you were talking about trusting in God.
Yep.
Because again, not really something you would maybe normally connect to wisdom, because, well, don't I get wisdom? So what does trust have to do with it, right? That's just kind of doing what he tells me to do. Where does the wisdom come from? And
that was my revelation, is like, God does not want robots. He never did. From the very beginning, he gave Adam and Eve choices. And even when Adam and Eve chose to eat of the tree of knowledge, God never cursed them. He cursed the serpent and he cursed the ground. What they experienced was natural consequences of their decisions. So I think that for me was another reminder, like the fear of the Lord. So I grew up Catholic. There's always like a Catholic guilt thing that is very mm-hmm. real. So fear of the Lord, if you would have talked to me then, was like trembling, which yes, is part of it, but only because of my own frailty. It's not because I think God is going to punish me. Like if I experience discipline, it's because I chose wrong choices. It's mm-hmm. a consequence of my behavior. Like so I started viewing the fear of the Lord as like, when you have a dad that is always going to be there, provide for you, he's telling you things because he loves you and he wants the best for you, well, then I'm going to trust you. And I respect you out of a place of trust, not out of a place of what's going to happen. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, yeah. And I think that's where it is. And when you have that kind of a relationship, I mean, there needs to be that respect, but then that opens it up for that kind of communication, and that, we pick up things from our Father, and we learn not even necessarily. I think that's where wisdom and the difference between wisdom and knowledge really comes in, because it's like you pick things up without really even knowing that you have, because that's what wisdom really is. And I forget which one of you all, I think maybe all of you said this, that wisdom is more, it's the application of knowledge, but it's how you use it, I think.
Yes.
Somebody said. And that just will come. If you watch your Father, if God is your example, you will start acting like them or doing the things that they do. You pick those things up without even really knowing you have. And that's where I think that difference is from just using your knowledge, because you will find those situations. It's not what's right in my eyes necessarily. It's what I know you would do. And when the you is God, then you're applying that wisdom and you're doing things in the way that he would have you do them. Jordan, you look like you want to say something.
Do I? I feel like I look like I'm listening. But I mean, yeah, I think fear of the Lord is something definitely that's important to touch on. I mean, you read a scripture that says literally wisdom starts with the fear of the Lord. So that for me is a clear connection of like, you can't even walk in godly wisdom if you don't first fear him and understand what that means. And for me, definitely trust is major, but I guess I break down fear of the Lord in my mind as a respect and an honor. Or even a reverence. I know you mentioned reverence yesterday, and I think of it in the lens of like my natural father, right? So as a kid, he would discipline me, and yes, there was fear. He's 6'7", he has a very loud voice. I was little, so yes, there was this, I guess, natural level of fear. But then as I grew and understood that, okay, he's telling me these things because the alternative is worse. Me choosing to do what he's telling me not to do, as scary as his voice may be or as tall as he is, it's actually worse to not do that. And so I like grew and learned like, oh, this is why he's telling me that. And then I got to a point in my life where I'm not afraid of you disciplining me per se, because I'm an adult, but it's more so out of honor and reverence for you and what you've taught me that keeps me from making decisions that I know are unwise or that are not like my father. So I guess applying that in this sense, it's not really like you guys said, it's not really a physical like trembling, but it's you get to this point of like, God, I understand you're telling me what you're telling me. And even Solomon is trying to tell his children these things to avoid what's worse if you don't listen to what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And you grow in honor and reverence, and so you choose to do things that please the Lord because of your respect for him and honoring him.
Yeah. I definitely want to get to Solomon at some point, because obviously what he did led to Ecclesiastes as well. But before we get there, I want to go to what you were just saying there, and Carrie, what you were talking about on Sunday is the beginning of wisdom is that fear of God. And I think that gets overlooked a lot, that you really can't grow in God until you understand God in a weird way. And like, how do you understand God without knowing him? And I get that. It's kind of oxymoron, but I think that gets lost a lot. And that, do you really understand who God is? And if you don't, then of course the rest won't fall into place. And I think that where we get to even Adam and Eve, I don't know that they truly understood, like I don't think they had that like fear of God in a weird way, even though they were created by him and they were with him. And that's its own like philosophical discussion that we can have that I'm not trying to start, but the importance of really understanding that you can't grow in relationship with God really, and I think that's mirrored in other people too, right? How strong is your relationship with someone if you don't really know them?
Right.
You could think you have a good relationship, but if you don't know that person for whatever reason, because they're hiding part of themselves from you or whatever, you're going to hit a point where that will show itself. And I think the same thing can be said of our relationship with God, is there's always going to be that point where we have to make a choice. And if we don't really have that firm knowledge of who God is, that just so increases the temptation to choose our own wisdom because we don't have that knowledge. Like, I know who God is, so therefore there is no choice, right? If you really know God, we wouldn't have difficulty choosing. And so it's this journey that we're all on to really know him, and then through that, the wisdom is just to trust him, which is, I think that's another thing that maybe you talk about wisdom, and we all think just intelligence, knowledge, because we're people, and I think that's what we're wired to. But I think really, and the more you've talked about it, and we heard on Sunday, it's like, it's a lot simpler than that. The wisdom is just knowing to trust God and follow him.
And I think it's a lot more complex, right?
Right,
because even that's why I knew I needed to include that New Testament scripture of Paul saying that Jesus became wisdom, and God has selected the weak to shame the wise, the insignificant to become significant. Like, godly wisdom does not make sense to the average person. And that stood out so much to me. And I think that comes back down to fear of the Lord or relationship, because if we really are trusting God, then we will trust him even when we don't understand, and I take a lot of comfort in, like, even the disciples didn't know what Jesus was doing, and I know that they probably had a fear of the Lord with Jesus, but they're still humans.
Right.
And I've watched so many just people pursue theological or, theological knowledge, and it can take you, if you let it, down a really dangerous path because it can become an idolatry of knowing versus a relationship. And I remember once in one of my seminary classes, we're having this great discussion, and the professor said, I just want to pause us because we're kind of on the precipice of, like, why are we discussing this? Like, if we go much further, is it actually because we want to know this specific aspect of God, or because we want to obtain knowledge for ourselves? And I'll never forget it. So it just, as you were talking, it reminded me of that, of staying in the place of relationship and trust and surrender.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's true. And I mean, because I know that is, obviously, we all have, like, questions. Well, like, what about this? Or is this a sin? Or what did you mean? What does this verse mean, or this passage? And I think that's, like you said, Carrie, it's so dangerous to, well, why do you care so much about this one particular answer? Is that going to affect what? Is it everything? Nothing? Why are you looking for that? Are you looking for that for justification for your actions? Or are you looking for, for other reason? I think that's kind of what you're talking about, where there's that danger in you're forsaking the relationship just to try and feel like you know things. Not to say we shouldn't study our Bibles.
No, it's so funny. I'm just thinking, so I always practice anytime I preach multiple times. And I think that's so important because we all need to be humble and receive feedback. And I was practicing with my husband, and I had a lot more initially, like, well, this is what this means. And he was like, why are you putting that in there? And I was like, well, I think it's important. He's like, why? Mm-hmm. I said, well, I want people to understand. Why? What do you want them to understand? And I was like, oh my gosh. So I took out everything that didn't relate to, like, a main point. Yeah. Because he was like, otherwise you just kind of look like a jerk. Like, you're trying to just say, this is how smart I am. And he was totally right, and not that was my intention, but it's just, I think that's another reason why we need community, because they can point out these blind spots, or they can kind of, just kind of call us out in moments where we think we're being wise, but maybe it's just a little bit of misguidedness or our own ego.
Yeah. Jordan?
I got nothing.
Okay. What do you want to talk about then, Jordan?
Solomon, you said you wanted to get there.
Well, okay, I guess we could get to Solomon. I can sympathize with that, just this idea of, because there is also, well, let's not get, that's like a discussion on, like, preaching.
Do it, Gordon.
No, I think it's off topic to kind of get into, like, the dynamics of teaching the word and all that stuff, so Well, that'll be on our other podcast,
There we go.
Pastoring the Pastors or something. I don't know what we'll call it.
Perfect.
Yeah, Pastoring with the Pastors. So Solomon, let's talk about Solomon. I love Solomon because I think you see Solomon, I think perfect is like the exact opposite of Jesus when you really think about it, right? He asks for wisdom and God blesses him. And rather than all these blessings and all these riches and all this stuff, he, instead of that bringing him closer to God, that actually drives him away from God, and it drives him towards the world, and he has all these wives and concubines and all this stuff. But then at the end, and this is where Ecclesiastes comes from, right? This, and Proverbs too, this like realization that like everything that I've sought after, this thing that I thought was good, that I thought I needed to feel content with life or fulfilled, is ultimately meaningless because it doesn't give me anything that I want, and I need God. And it's just amazing that, Solomon's such an interesting character in that sense because he is the wisest man. Like it says in the Bible, he's the wisest man to have ever lived. And yet that wisdom that was given to him by God, even that drove him, ultimately, he drove himself away from God.
Yeah.
And it just shows the depravity of our nature, that even with God, even with all the most wisdom from God, that nature drives us towards that apple, just like with Eve in the garden. And it can be daunting in that sense because it's like, well, then we're all just screwed, But it's also reassuring in that Solomon realized it, so that, and wrote out of it came all of this actual wisdom that can be applied to all of us, and we can kind of learn from his mistakes if we're really willing to ultimately submit ourselves to that, because it really does require giving up everything that your inside is like screaming for, And
isn't it interesting that Solomon was the son of David and Bathsheba? So this, if you read in the story of David, took Bathsheba. She was already married to someone else. And not only did he take her, he killed her husband. So it's like, I also think about it through the lens of, like we were talking about, with wisdom comes consequences. What we pass on from generations to generations. I also wonder if Solomon was ever kind of just took a moment to be introspective about what he saw in his parents and maybe what he didn't realize he was learning as a value or as permission to be a certain way. But there's wisdom in that too, right?
That's good. And I even think of, when you mentioned Gordon, he prayed for wisdom really to lead the Lord's people, the Israelites. That even goes back to that applying. He had the wisdom, but did not have the aptitude, or like, I don't even know what the word is, to even know how to apply all that wisdom that the Lord gave him. And even mentioning generations, I was thinking, Solomon is the perfect example of why it is so important to have godly wisdom and to truly live a life that's surrendered, because his children suffered because of his decisions. I mean, the kingdom became split after Solomon because he allowed his heart to drift away from God and what the Lord had told him. So he really is a good example of like the generational aspect of God, and why it's like wisdom is not just for you. You're getting wisdom, prayerfully to pass that down to the next generation. So yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I got a little sidetracked.
Got a little
You're
typey.
fine.
Yeah.
What's going on in the chat?
Not much. Just most of the people saying hi. I guess since we're talking about it, we got a question from Daviana, it looks like, who is asking about fasting and if it will kind of set. I'm going to assume it is a she, but I could be wrong. I apologize. So she asked, if I fast for 100 days, will I be set free from, she didn't specify, but a demon of some sorts. So I was linking her to our prayer request link just to let her know that we are here and are happy to pray for you and help you. I guess to answer your question, possibly. That's the unfortunate part of it. we were talking. Who was speaking yesterday? Darren, right? Yes.
Yep.
Okay, Darren. Like he was talking about Paul with the thorn in his side, and unfortunately, even with all that prayer, God said, my grace is sufficient, but that ultimately he's not set free from that. So, but we are here to encourage you and pray for you and walk with you through it. So that's what I was doing. So I'm sorry, I was a little distracted. So what were we talking about, Solomon?
Solomon,
generations,
generations,
wisdom,
humility.
Yes. Well, and that's I guess let's keep talking about that then. How do we pass on wisdom? Because I think that's the other tough part. And this actually gets back to preparing a message. So here we're tying it back. Look at me go. How do you you can't, right? Nobody, it's so impossible to force knowledge onto people. And how do we try and do that? What does that look like? Especially as leaders in the church, how do you take wisdom of God and knowledge of God, and especially with how we've been discussing it, with how much of it is that relationship with God? How can you really transfer that without transferring the godly relationship? And so what does that look like to you two? Like, how do you guys really...
I can say something and then Carrie can jump in and put that pastor's touch on it like she does. But I think we cannot underestimate that people are watching. So you can't... The Lord didn't give us the power to transfer wisdom to someone else, but people are always watching how you live, how you talk, the decisions you make. And so I think people can see wisdom modeled, and, you can be in prayer for that person can be in prayer just as Solomon, like, Lord, give me wisdom. And you can be someone who is a godly counsel for that person to help them. The Lord does the work. The Holy Spirit does the work, but we definitely can't underestimate people are watching. Whether they're saved or not saved, they're watching how you steward your finances, how you steward your time, how you steward your energy, how you have conversations, and what are you talking about, and what are you allowing into your ears, and what are you not allowing into your ears. I think people watch that, especially, the more you see them. If it's someone you work with, or if you're in school, someone you go to school with, they're watching kind of your flows through life, through seasons. And so I think they can be exposed to godly wisdom through that, but the Lord is the one who imparts it. So that would be my answer.
That's good. Carrie?
I totally agree. I think the biggest testimony we'll ever have is just the way we live our lives. And, for someone who's never, like, the fruit of the Holy Spirit isn't normal.
Yeah.
It's not normal. Or even I was just pulling up one of the scriptures that Darren referenced, James 3:13. It says that wisdom from above is pure. It's also peace-loving, gentle at all times, willing to yield to others, full of mercy, shows no favoritism, is sincere, and those who are peacemakers will plant seeds of peace. So I think those characteristics of wisdom just aren't normal. So when we come across people that are living those kind of lives, it's really like, I know for me, I'm like, what is happening? Like, I want to know. The first time I met Jordan, I was like, wow, I just knew, like, she has a lot of wisdom.
Oh my gosh, Carrie.
I did. And I've asked you about that, right? Like, because it's who you are. It's so, you can't, it's the biggest testimony. And I think that's the beautiful thing about Jesus, is that's all he asks us to do.
Yeah.
Is just live that way.
Yeah. I think that's good, and I think it's true. I mean, because again, like Pastor Pierre was saying, and Carrie, you echoed this yesterday, that the wisdom of God to actually act that out really is so counterintuitive to the world. And so I think not only is it important to remember that people are watching, but I think it's more important to remember that people will notice, because it is so, like, weird to them, and that. Yeah, I think it's just, I think too, it's a tough one, again, to really let go of all that, because it really is God kind of shining through you in a sense. And so know that people are watching, but don't be self-aware, if that makes sense. Because I think we have that tendency to kind of act in a way that we think we need to act to appear godly, and that can almost have a negative effect in a sense because we're sort of getting in our own head.
Right.
You know?
And that's why, like, again, this morning I was doing the Proverbs 29 reflection for the Bible reading plan. And again, I was like circling it uses the word motive so many times, and God wants to know, like, God cares about our heart. So it comes down to, like, what is our motivation? Like you said, Gordon, it's not about other people. It's about who God is. But when we remain in that humble place of being a child, of needing to stay at our Father's feet, that's what causes the fruit.
Yeah.
And that's what's so attractive.
Well, and you actually said that too, that wisdom comes from the heart. You said that yesterday. And that, I think there's so much there. I wish you could have I know you could have gone on for that but that's really important to understand, is that because again, it's all coming out of this natural, like, it's not wisdom. It's not wisdom in the way that the world would define it. And it is just action born from this understanding and love of God and from this heart that's been transformed towards God.
Can I take us on a tangent?
Please
real quick?
do, yeah.
Okay, sorry, apologies. But I am studying Jeremiah and Revelation simultaneously, and it is wild. Because in Jeremiah, the main thing is, like, these people will not repent.
Right.
They are unashamed, and they were doing some crazy, crazy evil stuff. And even when, Jeremiah's like, these are going to be the consequences of your decisions, they beat him up. Like, it's so crazy. And then to read in Revelation, like, all of the judgments of God that, like, Jesus is there. Jesus prevented a lot of those things from happening to us, like, like, he's the one that stands in the gap for us. And I just think that it really comes down to, like, that humility piece and remembering, like you're saying, it is about the heart always. And when we stay humble, it just prevents a lot of other things we don't have to worry about. And it's almost like, I brought up Revelation because, it talks about the saints that are there interceding in their prayers and those, the martyrs, like, even in their suffering, their testimony is true. Like, I think sometimes we get so caught up in these bad things happening, but not realizing God can work through those bad things and his testimony can go forward. Because even in our worst moments, and I don't believe God causes those things. I don't believe God causes bad things to happen, but I do think that his grace is available during those times. And God can work through it for us and for others. But we don't have the wisdom to see that in the moment. We're like, God, this is terrible,
Right.
Get me out of this pit. But how we wait, I think, is so important, and wisdom can be seen in those things.
Yeah, that's really good.
Nothing.
Jordan,
She said it all.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I do think that's, it really applies to everything, this wisdom, because I think, again, like we've been talking about, right? It's the wisdom is what you get from this relationship with God, and what is more important than our relationship with God. And so I think that's where don't be hungry for the wrong thing. I think, if that makes sense. It's good to have wisdom, and God will give you wisdom. And if you're facing, because maybe that's another thing that might be worth discussing, and we might be going into that in later weeks, so I might be jumping the gun here. But this idea of, like, godly wisdom, but then applying it to other situations, like, do we buy this house? Do I leave this job, or do I take this job, or do I marry this person, or whatever? Yep. That's not necessarily the same kind of wisdom, right? Or is it? And how does
Why wouldn't it be?
Well, I guess I'm saying more like, where does that, right? Uh-huh. Is that wisdom, or Yeah, I don't know. Answer that question, Jordan. I'm sorry.
You gotta
You take it. You take it.
Gordon.
You take
Wait.
it. I walked myself into a corner there.
I mean, we can't underestimate what's in his word. I feel like some of the things we, myself included, I have suffered in my life is because I didn't go to his word and see, what does your word say about this? So yes, wisdom, you can get wisdom through godly counsel. You can get wisdom through the Holy Spirit revealing it to you, a pastor. But we can't underestimate, like, literally, if your word is the authority of my life and everything comes second or after that, what does your word say about this?
Yeah.
And the word does talk about finances. The word does talk about relationships and friendships and different things like that. So I think when I think of wisdom and I hear that question, I'm like, give me more. Like, what do you mean?
I don't know.
Gordon.
Because I can definitely attest to different things that I allowed myself to enter into, and I did not read his word first. And it's like, well, Jordan, duh. You now had to learn this through experience. And I'll never forget this. I heard a pastor say, yes, experience is a great teacher, but it is so expensive. It costs time. It costs heartache, depending on the situation. And so I don't want to be a person who learns everything experientially. I do not. And so it's like, yes, I'm going to go to your word. Yes, I'm going to talk to people who I trust, as who I know are seeking you and are in your word and know your word and can maybe help me in those blind spots. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question.
I think that's a good answer. And I think it kind of gets to something that Darren was kind of speaking about as well, because he was talking about podcasts and listening to all these things. And I think there is that temptation of, like, I'm going to go and find all this knowledge, but like you just said, ignoring, like, the key, ultimate, actual source and what should be our first source, the word. And I remember one of my pastors too, before, was giving a message, and he's like, whenever anybody asks me, how do I deal with this problem? I ask them first, well, what does the Bible say? And if you can't answer that question, I'm not going to help you, because you need to go to the word, and then we can talk about it. Like, then come to me and say, I'm not really sure, right? Because we're not all deep Bible scholars, but that was his point, is like, if you are not going to the word first, well, of course you can't solve your problem. And I am not going to be able to help you solve your problem, because my answer is going to come from the word. And if you're not using that as your source, you need to start doing that. And I thought that's powerful when you think about it. But it is funny how all of us, and we've all been there, we've all shared about it on this podcast, routinely, like, forget to go to God first and try and carry things under our own weight and our own wisdom. So I think that was kind of what I was asking, trying to ask about, is like, where do we get that distinction between true godly wisdom and like what we think is wisdom, but is really just kind of us trying to take on the situation. So
I have no thoughts. I think that was great.
I think we did it. Okay. Wisdom conquered. Topic is over. We are pretty much at time though. So, and Carrie, I know you got to get going. So do you guys have any other final thoughts? No? Okay. Well, then we're going to call it. Thank you everybody for watching. It was great to be back. We will see you tomorrow morning, 6:30 a.m. in the Fishbowl still.
Woo-hoo, yes.
For prayer. This Wednesday is youth night, right?
Yes.
Yes. Very exciting. And this Sunday we have a guest speaker whose name is
Craig Wendell.
That sounds exciting. I'm looking forward to hear from him.
Who apparently does a Joel Osteen impression.
Yeah, I'm not going to get into that. But church, was great to talk to you. Great to be here. We will be back next week to discuss the message. Be blessed. Have a good week.